Christendom almost vanquished paganism, but it sort of survived by the skin of its teeth, and now paganism is coming back.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Saroof. My guest today is N.S Lyons, who runs a popular Substack called The Upheaval. Welcome, N.S.
Hi, Tom. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time. I wonder if, before we talk about, which I think will be the main focus of the conversation, is your recent First Things piece. Before, so that listeners have a better sense of who they're listening to, who they're talking with, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about yourself besides The Upheaval, or how you got into writing, other things that you like to do.
Well, the N.S Lyons, just so everyone knows, is a pen name, so it is a pseudonym. But I'm an essayist now, full-time, working at writing on The Upheaval, as you mentioned. Formerly, though, I was essentially a geopolitical analyst in Washington, D.C. for a long time, mainly for focus on China and U.S.-China relations. So that's sort of my background was, I guess you could say, a study of China, and by a long, circuitous route, I ended up writing about other things as well. But that's sort of my background, China and the study of the Chinese Communist Party.
Gotcha. And how did you get into studying the Chinese Communist Party? Like, what sparks your interest in that initially?
Well, I can't say I had any interest in the Communist Party in particular. I was just interested in China and sort of Chinese history, Chinese affairs, Chinese food, and so on, even as a young person. And so that sort of just led me in college to travel to China, to study China. And once you start studying China, the Communist Party is sort of an inevitable thing that you have to deal with, especially if you're into international affairs like I was.
Of course, yeah, it looms large. But I mean, we could maybe talk more about China, but I really did want to get into your recent piece in First Things, reviewing the what's the name of the book about re-paganization and its problems, because we've been talking a lot about religion in public life, especially in contemporary America, so it's something that should be familiar and relevant for the audience. But what maybe you could start by telling us what the book is that you reviewed, because I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, and also maybe what the main thrust of its argument is.
Well, the book was called Pagan America by John Daniel Davidson, who's a senior editor at The Federalist. So people should check that out. I enjoyed the book. But the essay at First Thing sort of expanded, beyond being a review, into sort of an essay on his broader thesis on, and not just his, but others as well, that America and the broader Western world is sort of in a state of re-paganization, meaning that it is abandoning its Christian heritage, not just as a religion, but as sort of a cultural norm. And so all of these things that seemed like normal, moral, and cultural principles to us that people maybe didn't think of, like the value of human life, are being occluded. And as we return to a more pagan way of thinking about the world, which is a very immanent reality where there's nothing beyond the world, and so power and technique and control over the world is what really matters, rather than anything transcendent.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show. Gotcha. And maybe you could say more about how this, for the author, how this manifests in daily life. Like, what's the evidence that we're moving towards a more pagan? I mean, I think I have some ideas. You probably have some ideas. Maybe you could explain more what is the sort of why why this is actually coming up, that we would say that we actually are becoming more pagan.
Well, let me say that Davidson does a good job of this. Let me use his examples, in part because he does it well, and in part because I sort of, in some ways, disagree with the thesis. But so if we think about, I think the best examples are sort of anthropological, in the sense that how do we think about like what it means to be human, and how we should treat others. So in the Christian sense, we think of people, the essential anthropology of people, as being imago Dei. It's made in the image of God, and everyone has sort of an inherent dignity to them, no matter how weak they are or how strong they are. So there's a sort of inbuilt equality. But in a pagan world, that's not the case at all. If someone is weak and would be sort of victimized or reduced in some way, say they're handicapped, we might still think of them in a Christian sense as being still inherently valuable and dignified in a human sense. But in the pagan world, that would not be the case. In, say, ancient Rome, they would be considered inherently less worthwhile in an inherent sense. So that's one thing, sort of at a basic level. But that leads to all sorts of other effects. Like when we think about what it means to be a good person in the world, in a Christian culture that is very much bound up with your virtue as a moral being, because there's sort of a transcendent reality beyond the immanence of the world, whereas a Greek or a Roman would see what it means to be a good person as to be essentially a strong and powerful and wealthy person, because that would be sort of the manifestation of your virtue is power in the world. So that's sort of a second step. But I think in today, what we're seeing is sort of a return of those values. We see things like, obviously, abortion, euthanasia becoming more popular. But I think in a broader sense, there's sort of a more subtle change in what we consider to be sort of a valuable person. We see a sort of narcissism and nihilism that I think also flows from this reevaluation of what it means to be a person in the world and only in the world, and there not being anything transcendent beyond that.
Okay. Maybe I'm getting this wrong here, but it seems like there is, within Greek or pagan thought, there's maybe like a low paganism of this, in the sense of pagan religion, how people in their daily lives would practice life, would think about like the mental constructs. I hesitate to use that word, but the sort of the mental maps of how people think about how to live life as a pagan. But then there's the more high-minded philosophical tradition of Plato, Aristotle, Stoicism, and maybe what you're describing, at least in how I'm seeing things, fits into that lower view. But there's this higher philosophical view, and maybe this is also a function of the fact that, at least I'm Catholic, I don't know about you, but there's a sort of Hellenization that happens, in the sense that a lot of early Christian fathers are influenced by, or maybe take various Platonic and Aristotelian and even Stoic sort of philosophical principles and marry them to the Christian faith in the early church. But it seems to me that I see in maybe the thought of Aristotle that the immanence of power and prestige and honor is very important. But there's also something that is more abstracted from day-to-day political life in, say, Plato or Aristotle. So I'm wondering if maybe you could tease out the distinction there, or if maybe we actually have to reread the philosophical tradition of the pagans in light of this more immanent view that has been underemphasized.
Well, I mean, I think here we're coming to where I disagree with Davidson. In sort of the second half of my piece, I get into this. because his view of paganism is very much the low paganism that you mentioned, not just the Greeks or the Romans conquering people, but the Vikings raiding, or the Aztecs, mass murdering their own people. So his view of paganism is the low one, and it's very negative. It's a world of a lot of bloodshed and sort of relentless cruelty. But I completely agree with you that there's something very different there with the Greeks and the Stoics, for example, later. And I think we see directly in these philosophical traditions the sort of thrust towards the transcendent. And I mean, obviously, as had been much discussed by historians, the early church sort of integrated the Platonic world so completely that it's a huge part of the sort of the faith, what became the church. And I think that was even there in the early church before that sort of formal integration happened. And also in the pagan world, I mean, I agree with C.S. Lewis, who's sort of put it that all around the world, not just in the Mediterranean world, pagan cultures sort of found different aspects of the Christian truth that were there already, and they sort of pointed the way towards it. They had little flashes of enlightenment in that way. So they weren't completely wrong. And I mean, if you read something like Plotinus and the Neoplatonics, I mean, it's sort of fascinating how much that points towards the idea of, or Aristotle with his unmoved mover. I mean, they're all pointing in the same direction of sort of towards this transcendent idea. So I think that's there, and I think that's there elsewhere as well, around the world. So it's not like the pagans were completely, well, I'd say my view of paganism is not as completely negative as Davidson's is. I'd put it that way.
Sure. So then, I mean, you did in the piece ultimately critique in the sense that maybe we actually aren't moving, even with his good examples, our re-paganization is not as comprehensive or really pagan as Davidson's making it out to be. So how do you get there?
Well, I think we are seeing a re-paganization in some sense, but I don't think that's the important thing that's going on. I mean, I think that Davidson has sort of this two-stage model of what's happened, which is we were in a pagan world. The Christianity happened, Christendom happened. Christendom almost vanquished paganism, but it sort of survived by the skin of its teeth. And now paganism is coming back. But I don't think that's the case, because in between those things, there was, almost a millennia of what we could call secularization and materialism. And essentially what we've seen is at least, 500 years of material modernity. And that I think is much more important than, and has had much more impact on the world, and still is, than anything we could call paganism. So I think what we're seeing now is I think the sort of crisis of liberal Enlightenment modernity, and that is sort of falling apart. And so as that collapses, I think that we are going to see sort of a re-enchantment of the world, for good and for ill. So from a Christian perspective, that the door will be opened to a less secular world in general, and that will mean potentially re-Christianization, a revival of Christianity, but also, a revival of other things, other spiritual pursuits like paganism and, frankly, all this like weird cult stuff, the occult, and so on. I think that we're already seeing that as sort of a revival of the popularity of these things as people sort of search for spiritual answers and they don't really know where they're going. So I think we're just going to see sort of we're all going to be off to the races in one way or the other. That's essentially my thesis.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting at the tail end of the piece how you make the case that a re-paganization is a good sense, sort of, in the sense that it's sort of re-enchantment. So it's almost like a paradox that Christianity defeats or transforms or supplants paganism um, but then as we've moved towards secular modernity, a re-paganization would mean creating the grounds again for Christianity to flourish again as it did 2,000 years ago when the church was first getting started. Is that what you have in mind? Maybe you could say more about
In
how
some
that
sense, yes.
works.
I mean, I don't think, I wouldn't prefer to see a repaganization. It would be great if we could just have the Christian renewal and we could stop that, go past that. But I think what's happening is the ground is becoming re-fertilized for religious belief in general. And that's a good thing, ultimately, I think, for the church. And the reason that's happening is because the iron cage of materialist modernity, is the way we put it, is falling apart. I think that's what's happening. And so as that declines, the door is open for all kinds of alternatives. And so one thing I think that's important to point out is that this question of immanence, I don't think that I don't think there's any inherent opposition between Christianity and immanence. Like, I think that's a mistake because I mean, there's certain, how do I put it? I think there has been a strain of thought in Christianity, and in fact, particularly first in Catholicism and then in Protestantism, that was sort of anti-immanent or had the effect of reducing the immanence of God in the world. But that was not originally there in the early church. There was no separation where God is outside the world and we're just sort of pointed only towards the transcendent. I mean, in the pagan world, the gods are in the world all over the place. The trees are enchanted with spirits, and you never know if the river is actually alive as a god and is going to punish you if you pollute it or something. So everything is imminent. And there's all sorts of, all the ritual of paganism revolves around this religious sensibility of the immanent world. But the early church, and even today the Orthodox Church, is much more sort of a balance where God is both outside the world and in it at the same time. So his energies are constantly in the world and inside all of us. And so God is there. God is still immanent, not just transcendent. And so I think that was sort of the original Christian take. And so it kept the world filled with the spirit of God at the same time, and only probably, I don't know, with the sort of the rise of nominalism and then scholasticism and sort of this very long process, God sort of got abstracted out of the world. And that sort of, the culmination of that was the Enlightenment, where we sort of complete that process and God is sort of ejected from the immanent world. So I think that, to bring it back, the re-immanentization of the world, in some sense, of the religious sensibility, is positive for Christianity. I think that was sort of a mistake to allow God to be ejected from everyday reality, as he has been, in a sense. And that's the material cage that we've been living in, and I think now is breaking down for better and for worse.
That's really interesting because, yeah, I see today as a materialist worldview. That's broadly, if you're thinking about the broad philosophical sweep of what's happened, and with the onset of modernity, maybe starting with Machiavelli or Hobbes, there is a sort of re-immanentization of human action in the sense that, what's Hobbes's line is that, power. It's like power seeking power that ends only in death. So there's nothing after. There's nothing transcendent. There's nothing outside of this life. The goal of life is to attain power. Same thing with Machiavelli. We don't have to care about justice, or justice is the interest of the ruling party or of the prince. There's more. These are sort of simplifications, oversimplifications, but there's a definite trend against the transcendent ideals. So in one sense, that resembles the sort of paganism that Davidson is talking about, or more pagan worldview. But on the other sense, what you're talking about is the paganism that might revive or recreate the grounds for a Christian renewal is markedly different from that. So can you tease out the exact distinction between a materialist paganism of modernity and a paganism of the pre-Christian civilization?
Well, let me first say that, I mean, you bring up these, Hobbes and Machiavelli, and then this sort of trend into, I guess you could put it, towards action in the world. I think that's very important, because what I think we see is a sort of vacuum created in the world, right? So the immanent nature of God is removed. At first, say before communism, say, and these other ideologies, Europe is still Christian, but it is sort of an abstract Christianity. And then I think what we see in the starting in the 19th century and then the 20th century is ideology is sort of taking the place of religion,
Right.
in part because the ideology is taking the place of God and also re-immanentizing it. So people talk about, immanentizing the eschaton. These ideologies are attempting to create heaven on earth through action, through praxis. And so I think that withdrawal of God opened the door to these essentially very murderous, bad ideas to come in and try to bring the transcendent back into the world. I think we see that all over the place. And moreover, that these ideas are sort of, in a real sense, Gnostic ideas. So the almost Gnostic heresies of Christianity, certainly communism is. So you have sort of a secret knowledge that if you're an expert, if you're the party cadre who knows all the writings of Marx and so on, you have the secret knowledge, the gnosis, to implement the heaven on earth. And you can sort of escape the nihilistic, disenchanted world of material modernity by sort of attaching yourself to this ideology and gaining this secret knowledge through this cult, essentially. And I think we see that in multiple movements, not just communism. But I think that was the result of this process of materialism, ultimately.
I mean, sitting in the background of this conversation to me sounds like we're living in the world of Nietzsche, especially in how he's responding to Hegel's historicism. Because not only do we have a more materialist vision, especially like within the Marxian sense, with dialectic materialism, but with Hegel, he's trying to impose almost a spiritual ideal onto the notion that there's this movement that moves all things towards some higher transcendent ideal, perhaps, but it literally does almost, at least for Nietzsche, his critique in the Second Untimely Meditation is that it saps all of the life, vitality, and energy out of young people when they're educated in this historicist way. And having this worldview saps any energy to actually do anything at all. And so sort of for him, the transvaluation of all values and at one point in Beyond Good and Evil, he talks about like restoring cruelty and bringing back wildness, going beyond good and evil in this sort of in this Christian sense is unleashing a lot of the forces that you're mentioning. So I'm wondering, and I think a lot of sort of neo-pagans look to Nietzsche as a guide for inspiration, or at least a more Nietzschean read of Western thought as a place for things to go. So I guess how would we wrestle with Nietzsche's contributions and
Yeah, so
what
I
he's
often wonder
outlined?
about this in the sense that the neo-pagans of, let's say, like the young right, online right, uh, the vitalists, they're looking for some vitalism to life, in the sense that all of the energy of life has been drained out, and many of them blame this on Christianity, as Nietzsche did. That by looking only beyond the world to the next life, all of the reason to have any passion for this life is drained out. And so the and so Christianity creates this life denying vision instead of a life affirming belief. But I wonder how much Nietzsche sort of mistook the Christianity of his day in the 19th century, which is the sort of materialized, de-immanentized Christianity that we've been talking about. This is at the tail end of the process of the Enlightenment. Let's keep in mind. So the Christianity of, say, the 3rd century would have been nothing like the Christianity of Nietzsche's day.
Right.
In this case, the Christianity is still an immanent religion. God is still in the world and sort of acting and present at all times. And so and I think that had a real impact on at least the sense of there being energy to life and life being meaningful, and something like the body and the vitality of the body being a real issue. I think that that just wasn't the same by the time Nietzsche's day, because this process of removing God from the world had already been sort of completed. So I wonder if I think this is a huge question for Christianity today. So I think that the neo-pagans or the Nietzscheans are sort of on to something, in that it's a big issue if Christianity is only sort of a life-denying ideology, and doesn't present any reason to have a vital life in your life before the next life. And so that I think that is an issue, but I think that the sort of where I'm coming from it is that is sort of a byproduct of changes that have happened in Christianity, it's not because Christianity is inherently life denying. I think that's sort of a mistake, a conceptual mistake that's been made over time. And it's a very long process. I don't think there's any one particular person or event to blame for that. But I think in the first centuries after Christ, that would not have been an issue that people would have recognized. That's modernity that is the problem, not Christianity, in my view.
That's interesting. And I was reading recently an article, I think it's in the most recent issue of American Affairs magazine, by Shun Yulong Peng, about how wokeness is, we think about wokeness, or conservatives who think about wokeness make a mistake when we view it as just another religion. But I feel like it's relevant to this conversation in the sense that he or she, I think it's a she, points out how this is not possible without Christianity. And it's this sort of, it's analogous to what you're saying in the sense that re-immanentizing, or we're not living in this sort of spiritual or spiritually secular age. It's a religion, but it's a Christian heresy, and it's has parts of. She mentions it's got parts of Puritanism, this intense morality, sort of browbeating, need for expiation, this intense sinfulness and need for absolution, and then also this highly liberal, egalitarian sense of Quakerism that's very egalitarian, very fair, focused on social justice, and so it's a sort of like weird mix between the two things, which you think are diametrically opposed. But and then it also takes on this sort of like, it does take on this like material, like immanent sort of, it's not pagan, but this more, and it's also not relativist because they actually do have a very strong moral compass, and it's not possible without Christianity, but it's highly opposed to Christianity. So I wonder how this fits into what we're seeing in today, is that wokeness is Christian, but it's heretical, and it also has some resemblance to paganism, but also is moving in a more spiritual direction as opposed to just secular modern liberalism.
Well, I think the answer is yes, and yes, and that it's. I think the difficulty with wokeness is that it combines, as you say, some very different instincts and components. So on the one hand, yes, I think it's absolutely what we could call sort of a Gnostic heresy off of Protestantism, off of Puritanism. I think that's sort of the best way to understand it. But it's a secular Puritanism. So there's no transcendent heaven, and so heaven has to be built on earth, right? So unlike, say, communism, there's this very personal element to it, in that the heaven will be built on earth when everyone achieves the knowledge, the gnosis, and does the work, right, to transform themselves into a new man, to become the sort of perfectly just and equitable person that will make possible the world to come. And everyone who can't do that, is evil and must be eliminated, pushed out, and that's why there's all this heresy hunting and so on that we see in wokeness. But then at the same time, there is a very liberal portion to wokeness, which is also anti-liberal. I mean, it's both at once, and that's what makes it so hard to categorize, because there is, in a sense, the woke side of liberalism, or the liberal side of wokeism, is this fixation on the individual and liberation from any kind of limits. So that is I think, probably best represented by the transgender component,
Right.
or faction, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, this is I see this as sort of coming straight out of liberalism at the far end. We can sort of remake ourselves in any way we want. And this sort of also gets back to the pagan idea of, you're immanent in the world. That's all that matters. Sort of the Nietzschean view, that you make yourself through action, and so if you're transgender, it's sort of you can remake reality by your own will. So it's sort of you liberate yourself from constraint that's been imposed on you, and you sort of do what you willed, right? So I think that's one very powerful portion of wokeness, but it's not the only one. Then there's, as you mentioned, there's sort of a very collectivist portion of it, or tribalist, which is sort of completely diametrically opposed, in the sense of, these are identities that we can't escape, like race. That's the most important thing, and you can't be liberated from your race that you were born into. You're sort of stuck with that, and so you have to reify that in some way. If you're white, then you have to sort of spend your whole life repenting about your whiteness, and if you're Black, you sort of embrace this identity and cultivate it in a sense. And so the problem with wokeness is that there's so many different strains to it that have all been mashed together, and I think that's sort of maybe a part of this sort of explosion of beliefs that I mentioned. I think is sort of beginning to happen as uh, Enlightenment modernity sort of collapses. All these things are sort of coming up at once, and I think that the reason they're together in wokeness is more a political reason, that just it's politically convenient for that to have happened, for all these movements to stay together. And they wouldn't necessarily be together if that weren't the political context was not the same.
Gotcha. Yeah, it is very interesting because, I mean, we've had other guests on this podcast who've talked about how wokeness is an outgrowth of cultural Marxism, and it's sort of foisted on us by the managerial, bureaucratic elite who have embraced the ideology.
That's simultaneously true, but I think it's sort of artificial in a sense of it's an artificial construct that brings together multiple things. And I think the managerial elite has sort of made it possible for wokeness to explode because they sort of weaponized it. But that's sort of what I mean by the political context of this. That
Right.
this is, there's the reasons for wokeness being so dominant has to do with, what our regime wants to happen in our various laws, like civil rights law, that make wokeness a sort of essentially compulsory in much of the economy and so on. So that the reasons it's become so powerful, I think, are those ones, essentially political reasons. But if we're talking about what is wokeness at a sort of conceptual level, I think it's much more complicated.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And I was just going to say, I think one of the things that a lot of commentators might miss is the sort of Christian progressive strand is underemphasized. Because if you're talking about it just as a managerial, cultural, or Marxist matter, it's like long march through the institutions, use civil rights law and create this whole bureaucracy, and then foist it on everyone, and then everyone becomes woke. But it doesn't, and this is what the article I was mentioning explains, is like it doesn't explain why that is appealing to people, or why that would be appealing to people. And it's still because there's this remnant of a Christian understanding or framework that gets appropriated or used to spread this out to the masses. Maybe we're coming towards the end of our time. My last question, or a couple questions we could talk about, is given everything that we've talked about, things that we're seeing now, you're looking at all of this, how do you prescribe we've diagnosed it, how do we prescribe a remedy? Where should conservatives, Christians go, look, and do for walking through this morass of various ideas and ideologies and structures towards, I think, what you and I both want, which is the Christian revitalization without the paganism, but if the paganism is a necessary part of it for a short time. Yeah, what do you recommend?
Well, I think there's sort of two separate questions there. One is what should Christians do, and one is what should conservatives do, as sort of a political angle. I think those are different things. I mean, for Christians, I think the answer is do not fear. Christ has already overcome the world, but more importantly, I mean, the sort of the answers are already there in Christianity. I think that's why this should be an optimistic time for Christians, because you have a sort of a country and much of the world, the Western world, is sort of in despair and doesn't know where to turn and is suffering essentially from nihilism and all these social problems that have flowed from that and from the ongoing collapse of Enlightenment liberalism and from progressivism and so on. And so they're sort of looking all over the place where to turn, and they're ending up in all these weird cults like wokeism. But they're looking, so that I think that is a tremendous opportunity for Christians And for them, I mean, these people, if they could find the way, they would be much better off. And I think that in some sense, I'm hopeful that because there's that possibility that they will find that, and not be sort of stuck in secularism forever. So I'm not too worried about the Christianity, to be honest. I think there's opportunity there for revival. I think the political question is much more difficult, and that includes the sort of persecution of Christians by the state and so on. So I think that's a difficulty for Christian. Now, as to how to sort of break free from the managerial leviathan that has taken over the West, I mean, that's much more difficult. And I'm sort of just beginning to work on my ideas on how to do that. I mean, I gave this speech at NatCon in Brussels in April about creating a parallel polis, parallel structures by conservatives doing this, which I think is an idea that's sort of been floating around there, but has not been fully realized in the sense that people think of parallel communities or whatever, sort of in the sense of the Benedict option of Roger, but people sort of think of that as running to the hills and forming your own community and sort of just trying to ride out the chaos of the times. I don't think it should be thought of it that way, in the sense that the parallel structures is how sort of every effective right-wing or left-wing movement that sort of replaced the regime has done it throughout history. Like if you want to be resistant and resilient to persecution, you want to have parallel networks to do that. If you want to be politically effective in creating legitimacy at the grassroots level and mobilizing masses of people in elections or just as a political force, then you need parallel networks at the community level. If you want to, it doesn't matter what you want to achieve. If you can build parallel networks outside the state, you're going to be way better off politically, and I think for Christians as well. So yeah, I'd say the secret is going to be organizing at this point for both conservatives and Christians and conservative Christians, just organize. And I think that when conservatives were making fun of Obama for being a community organizer, which was funny, but that was sort of a bad turn of events. What we need is a lot more community organizers on the right, in a general sense. That's the way out of this in general, in my view.
So go read Alinsky. That's just a joke.
I think that the right could learn from the left in the sense that the left sort of by nature is constantly organizing, constantly creating networks, constantly building sort of communities that are artificial communities. But I think that if you want to build real community, you can still use some of these tactics and strategies of the left. And that's what very effective right-wing movements and nationalist movements have done, say in Hungary or in India. Fidesz in Hungary began with what they call the civic circles movement, which was essentially to build grassroots community outreach throughout the country, and they built themselves an entirely new grassroots base with their own institutions, so that they could sort of escape the dominance of the post-communist left in Hungary, which sort of ran everything. And then in India, the BJP grew out of the current right-wing government in India that is tremendously effective, and they grew out of the RSS, which was this Hindu nationalist volunteer organization. They have millions of members, tens of thousands of chapters. They're getting young men to sign up and get up at 6 a.m. and exercise and then help all the little ladies clean their house. Like, this is like completely different from how we think about politics in the West, sort of as electoral politics, but it was tremendously effective. And so they've dominated India ever since they sort of chose to challenge the socialists for power. And they did it essentially, both these examples were self-consciously using left-wing tactics to empower the right. So I think there's real possibility there that is largely untapped in the Western world.
Okay. Last question for you, because when you were mentioning Rod Dreher, because he emphatically all the time says, and he said it on our podcast, I am not saying run for the hills. I am not saying just like get in the monastery and wait out, civilization to collapse and then rebuild from there. But so I think you're giving me a better sense of what the Benedict doctrine actually is, because when he says that, I'm like, I've read his books, I've read both of them. I've read the two most recent ones, and I'm like, okay, I understand what you're saying, but it also sounds like you're saying run for the hills, like take your kids out of public school. You should probably have a community where people are, fellow Christians, and be ready for totalitarian, for the Leviathan to come after you. And you have to sort of detach from various aspects of modern popular culture, which, again, that's also not a critique. That's probably a good idea. But it does sound like he is saying run for the hills, but you're saying and pointing out, if we have these sort of parallel institutions that are doing and picking up the slack for political life, that's not like the quote unquote coercive power from the state, but is doing, the things that political machines, for instance, used to do, that maintained a vibrant civil society at a local level. This is actually a key to long-term replacing the legitimacy of the reigning managerial state for something new.
So, I mean, I would agree with him that he's been misinterpreted. Now, the thing that makes it difficult to understand maybe is that, I would say that parallel networks like the Benedict option, the thing about it that's great is that it's very flexible, it's scalable, it's anti-fragile, which means you can use it to run to the hills, and you can hide in the hills until you're not hiding in the hills, until you say the regime's collapsed and you need to reassert authority. It's still, those communities, those networks are still the best basis to do that. So that a parallel strategy can sort of adapt to any situation, whether you're sort of in a position to contest for power or not, or you just want to survive. Whether you're just sort of at the worst end trying to survive, or you're trying to challenge the managerial state and sort of take over the whole thing and win completely, you're still going to use the same parallel networking strategy to do that. Because you have to think, like, how do you build political legitimacy, really? Political power, really. And I think our idea of that is sort of distorted by, centuries of a nice liberal democratic politics, where we've sort of, real political questions were settled, and we sort of just had a game, essentially, to choose who would be in power to make decisions. But the level of sort of existential politics was not there. I think that politics is now sort of at that level, this existential level. And so when you're in that situation, you need to think about how is political power actually built, and it's built sort of legitimacy on the ground, and maybe people don't think through what legitimacy means. Legitimacy means, like, you're in Afghanistan during the American occupation, this civil war between the government and the Taliban, and you're a villager and you need something in your life. Like, there's a dispute, you need a court system to resolve a dispute with your neighbor. like, who do you go to? And if you go to the Taliban, who's sort of running your local, they run their own courts in your province, and you go to the Taliban instead of the government because the Taliban is less corrupt. So what does that mean? It means that the Taliban has more legitimacy than the state. They're a shadow state that has more legitimacy. And I don't mean to endorse the Taliban, of course, using it as an example. So yeah, what is happening there? There's a shadow state and there's the official state, but the shadow state has more legitimacy than the state. And so what happens when the Americans leave? Suddenly the shadow state, which is really the real state because it has all the legitimacy, it has all the actual power, it becomes the state almost overnight. So that is how you build political legitimacy. You do things for people. If people are, and obviously, as I mentioned before, the communists did the same thing. Like if they build at the community level, like when the Soviets came into Poland, the communists are taking over. What do they do first? Like maybe they go to take over the military and the radio stations and so on. Well, they did that, but what did they also do? They immediately, from my study with the Poles, they take over the Women's Gardening Association. Like, why did they do that? Because they want to integrate themselves at the base level of community life immediately, so that when someone needs something or they have a problem, they want to garden better, where do they turn to? It's a party member in this sort of community organization. And so when people are turning to this level, to the party level in this case, in the communist system, like that sort of becomes their de facto ruling regime, regardless of what is at a higher level. And so when you have if you have a Benedict option community that is large enough that everything you need in life is can be there in this network, then that network is more real to you than the state. Then at that point, the network has real power. And so I think that, that's still sort of abstract, but if conservatives, whether in the United States or wherever else, can sort of build networks that are resilient to state pressure, that can provide for their members, protect their members, serve their members, like that would be very hard for the managerial state to deal with. That is sort of the natural enemy of the managerial state is self-governing, grassroots self-governance, and community building from the bottom up.
No, this is very good. And it speaks to, I think, what we've been talking about for a long time, for most of the conversation about re-immanentizing politics. If we're doing this within the confines or the context of a Christian and conservative membership or sort of organizing principle, then this is bringing God back into the world locally. It's also has political aim. So those are all very good. And like I said, you just gave me, I think, the key to unlocking Rod's larger political vision, and maybe for
just very quick. I think that what is the single best example of this sort of parallel community building that I'm talking about in history? It's the early church. The Christians are being persecuted in Rome. This is their strategy that they used that was tremendously effective to sort of spread Christianity through charity and so on. And it's an underground network, essentially. That worked very well for them, and it was very resistant to persecution from above. So that's a great example. So they're not necessarily separate, I suppose.
Awesome. Well, N.S, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate you coming on and chatting with us. If the Upheaval is your Substack, so we'll link it in the description. We'll also link this First Things article and your NatCon speech. What else would you recommend to listeners, if anything?
Well, I think that's a great place to start. If you're interested in sort of the community building and its opposite that we've been talking about, I have a new article coming out in City Journal magazine. It's actually already out in their print issue, but will be online soon, about the Ford Foundation, the sort of the antithesis of community building, let's say. So check that out for the opposite view of the managerial astroturfing. I think that will be interesting to people to check out.
Perfect. Great. We'll link that as well when it goes online. But thanks again, N.S.
No, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select Modern Age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.